Hello, Saul. Thank you for joining me with Advertising and Society Quarterly.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to it.
So to start us off, I know that you have done a ton in your career. We're going to cover lots of different topics. So to give folks who are watching this a flavor of your extensive background, can you tell us more about your career and how you got to where you are? So where are you today and how did you get here?
So that's a very good question. The way I describe it, I'm in the business of ideas and impact. So that kind of sits somewhere between coaching and consultancy. And the way I describe it is I can help people and organizations outperform the world around them through applied creativity. So that can be big multinationals, it can be academic institutions, all the way down to individuals wanting to shift their careers. And also I do a lot of work with startups trying to work out who they are and what they're doing. I also do, I've got a funny title, I'm a preceptor at the Side Business School. So that's a funky word for I'm a tutor. So that means I help with the strategy and innovation course, which is business strategy and innovation, not advertising strategy, but we can talk about the link between those perhaps later. I'm also an expert advisor there. So I do mentoring and careers work with the alumni, but also the current students. But I've also got a number of kind of advisory positions on one for a mental health organization and a couple of others for more kind of industry standard stuff like CMO Council, New York festivals, effectiveness, things like that. So how I got there is probably more of an interesting journey. I'm born and bred in Cambridge in the UK. I came, not surprisingly, I was brought up in a very kind of liberal environment. My dad's a folk musician, so a singer-songwriter. My mum was a careers officer. And then they divorced and then later remarried. My stepfather's an academic. My stepmother's an artist. It's got very kind of rich, non-directive kind of childhood. So I was kind of allowed to just explore my own stuff. And I was also allowed to I did a lot of volunteering. I was very kind of active in that space as a kid. I was kind of a youth trustee as a teenager on a homelessness charity, and I did a lot of work in a local mental hospital. I don't know what you call it now, but a local mental hospital. And I just became very interested in people and why they tick, and what are the motivations behind that sort of stuff. So I ended up, after I did my A levels, which is the high school in the UK, I went to Durham University, which is one of the really good universities in England, and studied cognitive psychology with a focus on memory, perception, and also I did my dissertation on depression. So I've always found very interesting people and how they tick. And then after I left there, I actually had a place to read clinical psychology. I had that's to do a PhD basically. So become something that qualification that you have. I had funding. I just realized I wasn't interested in carrying on studying. It just wasn't really me. So I then tried to work out, well, what do I do? What do I do with all these qualifications and stuff? And I ended up applying for the advertising industry because it seemed like a place that combined that interest in people and psychology, but also creativity. And again, I've because of my dad and music, I've always been very interested in creativity and art and things like that. So I was trying to work out what might sit in the middle between those two things. I suspect I'm not alone in this, by the way, about why I went into that world, but ended up joining, I got a job graduate trainee job at Saatchi & Saatchi. I was with them for almost 10 years. They were very good to me. I have very fond memories of it. And during that time, I'd been at Saatchi London about 2.5 years, and I went to see the CEO at the time, a guy called Adam Crozier, who actually ended up having a stellar career outside advertising. He was the chair or CEO of the Football Association. So that's the organization that organizes all English football. But also, I think he ran the post office. He was a really, really nice, fine, smart man. And I went to see him and I said, look, in retrospect, this seems like a ballsy thing to do. I don't think I realized it at the time. I said, look, I'd really like to travel. I'd love to stay within the family. could you help me find a, can you help me get a job? And he said, where were you thinking of? I said, New York, maybe Sydney. And he goes, all right. And like about 2 hours later, I got his secretary called me and said, Adam's written a letter for you, and he's just sent it to the CEO of New York and Sydney. I said, oh, that's nice. And he sent it to me. And it was, I've never told him this, but I thought he might have been drunk when he wrote it, because it said, this guy's incredible. He's one of the best people here. I desperately don't want to lose him, but when he wants to go, you'd be mad not to take him. I mean, I just like, sure, he can't be talking about me. That can't be right. Anyway, I got a job offer both in New York and Sydney, and it's funny how these things just make a decision like that, and it changes your life. I ended up in Sydney because it was the New Year's Eve was coming up, so it was 99. The Olympics. I've always wanted to be in an Olympic city, and I like surfing and swimming, and so it ticked those boxes. So I ended up staying there for almost 10 years, most of that with Saatchi's, but I made the switch from account management to strategy. I just found my natural skills were better in that place. I wasn't particularly organized, honestly, so I found thinking about things and giving shape to things easier than just organizing things. So it's always good to know what you're not good at. And then I had ended up with a kind of regional APAC role in strategy, which was very interesting. But then my father got cancer, and my partner at the time got a job in the UK. And so we kind of moved back. Very, very difficult to do, honestly, after 10 years in another country. Moved back to London, and I ended up in the Y&R network, which is how I know Gord, which is a mutual colleague of ours. And I ended up, I was the CSO of the UK for Y&R, and then I became the EMEA CSO for Y&R for like 6 years, and then 2 years after the merger with Vilma Y&R. And I'm very proud of that time, but I realized there was a moment when I was getting deja vu, and I was in meetings. I said, I'm sure I've had this meeting before. But also I had this sense of, I'm good at this. I've ticked a lot of boxes, as a network, had a really, really good partner. So I had a guy called Andrew Dimitri, who's the CEO, had the chief creative officer, a guy called Jamie Vandelbaum. We're good mates. We still are. So I had, it was kind of perfect work environment, really. It was, based in London, and came back to Paris. But I just realized I was bored, and I wasn't growing. And I'm one of those kind of people. I think I've got that kind of restlessness, and I'm just not very good at settling. So I started trying to work out, well, where could I grow? If I stay within the organization, where could I grow? And I realized I probably need to go back to school and do. I know this is one of the reasons why we're talking, is that I thought I need to carry on learning and push myself a bit, because I'm not pushing myself. And I applied for and then got a place to read a master's at Side Business School in Oxford. And it was a 2-year, it's a kind of remote learning. So you do, I think it's 5 weeks in Oxford over the total, and you have an exam when you're there. But most of it's remote. So it's quite stressful to do that and have a job at the same time. A lot of my other colleagues also had children, so I don't know how they did that. So I did that. That was a very, humbling is an overused word, but it was a very humbling experience, because I realized firstly I didn't actually know what strategy was. Given my title, I was on a global board. I'm just like CSO, and I realized actually I'm not sure I know what I'm talking about anymore. My hunches are right, but there was one of the professors. He had, after one of the first modules, he said, "Okay, so you guys are all in this sort of area. What strategy?" And there's some very, very impressive people in that room. I'm not sure I'm one of them, but there's very impressive people in the room, and almost none of us could actually explain what it was in a really simple, pithy way. So and you have to do these ridiculous. There's a thing called subfusc, which is the academic dress, but you have to, when you sit an exam, you have to go into these very kind of ominous halls, and you have to wear. I was more dressed up for the exams. I did 5 of these than I was for the graduation ceremony of when I did my undergraduate degree. It's like, this is so weird, especially if you're from Cambridge, which is much more liberal. They just don't do that. That you can turn up in your exam how you want to. Anyway, so I kind of did. I finished that up. It was, it was a really great experience for me. And then I had, just shortly after I finished, I got a call from the United Nations. Somebody said, look, your CV's been identified. You've been identified as somebody who's, like a leader in your field. But we're recruiting a new position, which is Chief Marketing Officer for the World Food Programme, which is the really big one, like the one that is the kind of backbone of the UN. And I mean, if you look at I've always had that kind of altruistic side to me. I did a lot of surf lifesaving in Australia. I was a captain of the surf club and things like that. So that's been a big part of my life. And I always wondered whether that was something I want to do a lot more of. And so when this came up, I thought, okay, I'm not going to not say yes to that opportunity. And there's a very long recruitment process, from panel interviews, which I've never done before, proper psychological testing where you have a psychometrics and an interview with a clinical psychologist, kind of no go situation. And eventually I got the job after 7 months, and my wife and I moved to Rome. It was not an easy transition, because we arrived there and then 4 weeks later we got locked down. So it wasn't the ideal situation. And looking back on it now, those years I spent there are the kind of best and worst experiences of my life. And it's one of those things that you think it's going to be your perfect job, and then you realize your perfect job isn't really your perfect job. The way I describe it, and it took me a long time to work this out, is there's a kind of functional bit, which is I'm not particularly organized. So that kind of job requires good thinking, good leadership, but it also requires you to be very organized and be okay with having lots of meetings all the time. That's not really my operating system. I don't thrive in that sort of world. But there's also there's a book called, what's he called? Robert. I have to try and remember the name of him. Bruce Feiler, I think he's called. He wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions. And it's about, the central argument is that there is no such thing as a midlife crisis. We're all constantly in transition moments, whether we choose them or not. But he's got this, that's interesting on its own, but he's got this lovely framework which he uses, which he says, as you navigate these things, you're balancing between three things. One is agency, which is anything you're doing, you have a sense that you can have an impact on it. Belonging, which is a sense that you're not alone and that others are with you. We're social animals. And then cause, which is you feel like you're doing something that's important and matters to other people. And I cause-wise, it's the UN World Food Programme. That ticks a lot of boxes for me. Belonging-wise, they're just a really, really nice bunch of very smart, committed people. I learned a great deal. But agency, I was very senior, sort of D1, which is very, right at the top of the tree. But I had lots of responsibility, lots of accountability, but I didn't really have much authority. So, and in retrospect, I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that's the kind of agency bit that was missing for me, alongside the operational stuff. And then, so I had a difficult conversation with myself, and then with Emily, my wife, and then with them. So this isn't quite right, is it? It's not working out. And I made a decision at this point, which my mother still doesn't understand. I decided not to. I just thought I had this deep sense that I needed to try something else and step away from the warm embrace of large organizations. And that felt very strange. It still feels a little bit strange, honestly. But I just thought I'm going to just start experimenting and see what life throws at me. And so we moved back to France, started playing around with things. I mean, it was very challenging for lots of reasons, because I've always worked within organizations. I was very good at create agendas within organizations, also following other people's agendas within them. I actually had to create my own agenda and also find out what I was post the UN and post Oxford, because I obviously had a different kind of skill set, but it's quite difficult to explain what it was. But also there was this framework called the explore exploit framework, which and perhaps we can unpack this later, but it basically is saying in order to kind of thrive in the long run, and it's talking about organizations, but I immediately applied it to myself, which was you need to be able to exploit what you're currently good at whilst exploring what you need to be good at in the future to succeed. And it's based on the idea that the exploit bit is about what they call incremental innovation. So little innovations about efficiency and optimization. The exploit stuff is about playing around, making big leaps, experimenting, failing quite a lot. Those are two very different animals. They often don't like each other and they try and kill each other. That's essentially what it is. So for me, I was trying to work out what the bridge between what I used to be good at, what I'm reasonably well known for and well paid for, with what do I want to be good at? What can I do in the future? And you know, that was at the heart of this conversation I was having with myself. And I kind of I basically did things that I knew would be uncomfortable for me. So I started reaching out to lots of people, having conversations with interesting people. Some people I knew, some people I didn't. Also just started doing stuff for free and kind of exploring hunches and creativity. And you know, that idea, I call it generosity returns, where it's not a transaction. You know that if you're nice to the world and do good things, eventually it'll come back. It may take 10 years. But those sort of conversations, that's really how I got to now. Is I started having some very interesting conversations with people at Oxford. So one of the advisory positions I hold is with My Mind, which is a for-profit mental health platform. So, but I started with I sat next to a guy called Dr. Henry Majed, who's now become a very good friend. But I just happened to sit next to him at one of the dinners, and we got on well. And I've quite a few other people have kind of come into my life that way. Others who've just reached out to me. You know, that it's funny. These sort of things I wasn't available to do those sort of things before, and because I stepped away from the industry and then came back into it. That's why I've kind of got this slightly different view on lots of things now, but only because I stepped away from it and came back in. I think that's one of the benefits of academia too. Perhaps we can talk about that later. But that's how I got to here. It's a very short introduction to my slightly complicated life.
Well, thank you for sharing. I think it reminds me that, you know, when a lot of my students say there's always one direct path. And I think, you know, the more we talk with different folks through the journal and we're talking to you, it's, you know, a journey that has all kinds of nooks and crannies and little corners that
Ain't that the truth? Ain't that the truth?